you?
Doing well, absorbing some of the forest vibes around me, so, the sun's very nice today.
It always looks so beautiful where you're recording from. Here it's rainy and gray, but kind of nice autumn weather. Yeah,
Yeah,
I got
this
my
is
tea.
I've got the
Yeah,
soft focus, so it always makes it look good.
well, I was impressed with that too. What would you like to talk about today?
Well, so I reached out to you, because I'd been recently doing this deep dive into the subject of menopause because I've been getting a lot of questions about it, from my patients and colleagues, and I realized that it was an area that I didn't feel like I had good expertise, and then I started to read some current popular books based on what people were asking me, like, "So and so said this and blah, blah, blah said that," and so I'm like, "What are they saying?" And so I read a bunch of books, I listened to, like, hours of in-depth podcast interviews. Everyone's contradicting each other, and I was able to sort of tease out the threads of the story because it's all about story again, and then asked, "But what does the Neijing say?" Well, so, I was curious about your thoughts on this, and I think it's also, even though menopause sounds fairly specific, it's actually also an interesting way of discussing ideas around aging and models of aging, and also around hormones and models of hormones. So I think we can there's a lot that we could cover and bring in this Neijing perspective.
Oh my God, I love this subject for several reasons. It's also the cause célèbre of the internet at the moment. It seems every time I open my email, it's like, join us over this podcast on menopause, and which is wonderful because we tend to be youth based, and when we see any attention given to aging, it's a sign of maturity, right? And we say every aspect of the circle of life is sacred, equally sacred. So, but menopause is, oh God, it's such a fascinating subject. We could have 5, 10 podcasts on this because it's so multi-layered. Like on one layer, we have, the issue of how do you treat it? Is it a disease? Do you have hormone replacement? That's kind of what's out on the internet right now. On another layer, we can say, well, what did the ancient Chinese texts say about it? Did they have an opinion on menopause? And they did 2,000 years ago, some very insightful things.
So let
But
me just interject there. So if the ancient Chinese 2,000 years ago had an opinion on menopause, then you're saying that the people who've written books saying that menopause is only 100 years old might not be accurate?
yes,
Okay, that's a good I just wanted to throw that in there.
right. And the third layer is, well, we practice nature-based medicine, which means we're always looking to understand things through the patterns of nature's design. So what does nature tell us about menopause? That's a whole nother layer. Then there's this layer about how Western medicine treats women's health care.
Yeah,
Like that is a whole other podcast, right?
yeah.
That's so deep and so many, and that all reflects back on all the other aspects of this. And then there's the issue of how our culture treats women in general.
Yeah.
And all these things actually play back upon each other. So they're all intertwined. They all have an important a part to play. And they're all very deep. Maybe we should start by saying, agreeing on terms. There's a lot of fluidity in gender expression. So maybe can we, for this conversation, do you think it's reasonable to say when we use the term women, we're talking specifically about humans born with uteruses and menstruating?
That that works for me. I'm not gonna speak for any group of people when I say that that works, but
Right.
for me, that works.
I have to say I'm not up on the latest terminology, but
Nor am I.
But I just hope that people listening know that we come from the spirit of inclusion and respect for gender expression. But when we're talking about menopause, we are talking about human beings born with a uterus primarily. But I would also have to say this. What's one thing that Neijing says right away? It's something that happens to both men and women. It's a natural process related to how the phases of our life turn, and it happens to both men and women. It's a little more clear cut in women. The signs and symptoms are a little more clear, but the exact same thing is happening for men. So, this is like an amazing topic. Oh my God. Where should we even begin?
Where should we begin? I'll take your lead, we'll see where we go.
Okay. Well, which of those layers do you want to talk about?
Well, I don't know, if for me, starting at the center and then moving out means that we start talking about menopause and perimenopause as a thing first, before we get to things like, equality in women's health, which is, like, kind of like a bigger monster, um, you know what I mean? So maybe let's start closer to the center.
Okay, where's that center?
Well, so, in terms of, uh, well, one thing that was interesting for me is as I read these books, I was able to sort of decode them a little bit. And so there were, some very large overlying worldviews and questions that informed kinda everything the author was saying. And so one of those questions was whether or not they viewed menopause as a disease or not.
Right.
There are popular authors who view it as a disease, and that's going to lead to a certain line of thinking and a certain set of recommendations. And those who see it as a part of the breath cycle and a natural transition, not to say that we don't do anything with it, but it's just a different schema of what they're
Right.
talking about.
And a disease kind of implies it's something you get, and some people get it and some people don't.
Mm,
And from the perspective of the Neijing, they would not call it an illness. They call it a part of how life breathes.
mm,
And, in Neijing, nature-based medicine, we have a specific definition of an illness. We call it a fixed pattern illness. It means your body's a breathing tensegrity formed around light. And an illness is something that happens when an event occurs which impairs that breathing and is stuck.
mm,
And from that point of view, menopause is not an illness. It's a way that life ages.
mm.
And the symptoms you can get from that can be more pronounced or not, but it wouldn't fall into the category of disease from the Neijing point of view.
That's interesting and helpful because as I read through the literature on this, I came to the conclusion also that it was not a disease without having, the kind of that sort of, solid perspective of the Neijing, inasmuch as that there's a couple things going on. One is that the argument that it is a disease first comes from very well-intentioned folks who don't understand what life expectancy means versus lifespan. And so if you look at your average life expectancy of a woman in 1900 is like 45. So then they take that to write an entire book and say, therefore, like women didn't go through menopause, until the last 60 years. But unfortunately, that's not what that means. What that average is including a lot of infant mortality and infectious disease. And so what you find then is if a woman survives to reproductive age, her life expectancy then becomes like in the 60s, and every time she gets older, her life expectancy goes on. So the what I found looking at the research on hunter gatherers is that for an adult, the modal age is like 72.
Right. And of course, now women outlive men. And in the Neijing, they said if you live a good life, your lifespan for both men and women is about 100.
Right.
Yeah. So there is that. We think we're really advanced and healthy, but actually, hunter gatherers, like if they live past, not being eaten by a tiger, they were a lot healthier from us in many ways. They got out and walked all day. They were
Oh
eating
yeah.
fresh food. They were in the sun.
I've
You
got
know,
some amazing papers on that.
yeah,
I
yeah,
mean, amazing papers looking at activity levels of, these kind of like post-reproductive females, right? These like, women in their 50s and older, and they walk more and do more intensive exercise than a modern 20-year-old.
right. And you see that like in some tribal cultures today.
Yeah.
Still. Well, maybe we can. You want to go back to the Neijing and see what they say? Should we
Yeah.
start there?
Yeah, let's do
Okay.
it.
I'm just going to pull up some text here, and not that one. First thing I'd say is that they talk about it right away in the first chapter. And I'm
Yep.
just going to pull up my notes here. Here they are. And in the first chapter, it's called Looking Back to the Ancients for the Truths of the Universe. That's kind of the description. And they're talking about life and about people in the old days and people in the modern days and what was the difference and what did they do and what was a good life and that they lived to be 100. But there is this passage in the middle where they're talking about having children and what happens when you get older and a person can no longer conceive a child, a male or a female? Is it due to a decline in their health or the natural order of things, which kind of goes back to our question about it? And then Chibo, the minister, launches into this passage, and they're going to talk about the development of a boy, of males and females. So, when a girl reaches 7 years of age, her kidney chi begins to develop, her teeth transform, and her hair grows. So, her teeth is an extension of the bones. The hair is an extension of the northern blood, we say, of the kidney system, and it means that the beginning of the transformation happens in a kidney organ, a song organ, and through its maturation. Like, here's an interesting question. I remember when I was a kid, and, in the beginning of my life, myself with the other boys, we kind of thought the girls had like cooties, and they were like, don't touch me and stuff. And then something happened around 13 where all of a sudden they got this special allure, it caused this special tingle, and hope some version of that was happening in the opposite side. um, why is that? Why do you go from kind of what we might call a non-sexual being to a sexual being? And when we think of our organs, when they're new, they're kind of uniform and they're not really developed yet, but around the time of 13, 14, they start to develop. What does that mean? That means their poles of yin and yang separate and they contain essence, really. So this is it's beginning with your organs, with your kidney organ, which is the root. And then it says at 14, there's this very special term here we're going to talk about called tian gui. They say it arrives. And what is the tian gui? We need to have a conversation about that. That's very interesting. If you talk to a Chinese person, the word for menstruation, one of them is tian gui, and that comes from the Neijing 2,000 years ago, although people don't really know what it meant. But actually, that's a mistranslation, as we're going to see. It doesn't mean menstruation. Gui is the 10th heavenly stem and was part of the calendar system, and Tian means heavenly. So Tian Gui means heavenly stem, but Gui also means a kind of water. It's associated with the northern time, the kidney pole. The kidney pole is where our fertility comes from, where our gene essence comes from, that allows us to have children. And in the northern system, there's two kinds of water. There's the yang water, which is like a strong flowing river, and then there's the yin water, which is like dew, and that's the character of Gui. So this is actually, when we look at the Neijing story about menopause, it's actually a story about water. And I'll just, as an aside there, I'll say in early China, there was a much different understanding of the water. And for modern people, we think it's monolithic. It's H2O. It's the same everywhere, has the same quality everywhere. For Chinese people, they didn't have that. And they were very aware that the quality of water was different everywhere. So, like the medicinal qualities of snow water was different than dew, was different than rainwater, was different than this river water, and so forth. And they all have different qualities. Even blood was considered to be a kind of red water that runs through the rivers of your body. So we're talking about a special kind of water here when we talk about Tiangui, and it's called northern water. What northern water has the memory, our Jing essence in it. So it's a kind of water that that starts to mature when you're an adolescent, and it carries memory. Remember, early Chinese people, they didn't know anything about oocytes or sperm. They just saw liquids and things like that. So it's a story about water. Now, how do we know that it's not about menstruation, that it's been kind of mistranslated today? Is because men have it too. In the next paragraph,
Okay.
it talks about
That'll do
that.
it. That's compelling.
Yeah. So, like, for example, in Chinese, the name for menopause is Tiangui Jie, means that Tiangui is exhausted. And Tiangui means menstruation, also Lai Yue Jing, which means the monthly endurances come. That's another name for
Mm.
menstruation. But Tian Gui is one. So they say at 14, the Tian Gui arrives. So it's a kind of water. And then they say river systems start to open. So when the
Mm.
organs mature, the Ren Mai opens. That's the river in the front of your body that's set down when you're an embryo. the Tai Chong, which is running in the aorta space, it begins to flourish. The monthly events begin, and menstruation begins to descend, and she is able to conceive a child. So let's just stop there. What kind of water could they be talking about? So, what is a water in both men and women that comes in adolescence? What do you think?
I'll let you feel that.
Right. So, what happens when you become sexually mature? Well, one thing is men start to ejaculate and they have semen, which is a kind of water. It's a thick water, Jing rich water, right? Women, when they start to come into sexual maturation, start having vaginal fluids with sexual excitation, right? And that's a special kind of water. And so my read of this is they're talking about the waters that come
Mm,
with sexual maturation, and that for them, the creation of a child might have been the mixing of primordial waters,
that makes a lot of sense.
right? Okay, so there's a special kind of water, and it's related to your organs developing and rivers opening, right? At 21 years, the kidney chi is balanced and even. The teeth grow and reach their peak. At 28, the tendons and bones become strong and hardened, and the hair reaches its peak. The body is full and vital. At 35, the yang ming channels related to the stomach running down the front of your body and through your face decline in strength. And by the way, we see that like with the wrinkling on the face that happens like with growth
Mm,
and things around the face. Um, And the complexion withers and the hair begins to thin. At 42, the three yang channels decline in strength of the rivers. The complexion withers and appears burnt, and the hair turns gray. At 49, the Ren channel, the embryonic river that runs down the front of your body, becomes deficient, and the Tai Chong, the aortic space vessel, declines and weakens. The Tian Gui is exhausted, and that's the term for menopause today in China, and the earth passages close. The earth passage closes. And that might be like, we don't know, it might be something like the cervix or the opening outward. The form of the body is in decline, and she can no longer conceive a child. So, this is why we say it's not really a disease, it's a part of the way nature breathes in terms of being born. And we want to take a little aside here and talk about the life cycle. So, in Neijing nature based medicine, we start with the idea that the universe is a breath moving into different conformations in and out of form, a single breath, and that everything is described the best by understanding it as a breath. That includes things like menstruation, but it also includes your human life,
mm,
right? So, if we look at your human life, it has a sunrise when you're born. It has a morning when you're young. It has a midday when you're an adult. It has a later afternoon adult. It has an older age when sunset is coming and you're returning. So when we say a good life is one lived with temporal rhythm, it means you live according to the breadth of your life phases. Um, and so, an interesting thing happens when you look at midlife or 50, it's about halfway through that process. And the body tends to have trouble when it's making course corrections or going around a bend. Like in the body, when things go around a bend, it often gets stuck there. When the body makes a transition, often symptoms come out. So, like in the initial phase of the breath of your life, it's outward going, it's expanding outward, it's a yang phase. In the mid part of your life, just about the time these rivers are shutting down, then you have to make a course correction. And now you're turning and facing the return back to your return, back to the cosmos, when you die. And when you look at patients, they often have trouble right at this phase. Like people will be doing fine, and then around 45 to 55, they'll start having all sorts of trouble. And then if they make it past that, they do pretty good till 80. I don't know, you've probably seen that too. Anyway, that's an aside for this. Let's read what happens to a boy because it's the same. When a boy, but here they move in multiples of 8 years. When a boy reaches 8 years of age, the kidney chi is replete. The hair begins to grow and the teeth transform. At 16, the kidney chi flourishes. So again, organs begin to develop and rivers open according to that. The tian gui arrives. The jing chi overflows and yin yang are in balance. Now, what could that mean? That's like ejaculation with semen, you know? So this is why I think tian gui is a kind of water. And so this, I love this description about conception too. It's like the mother and the father, or the, they mix their waters, their primordial waters, to create a new life from water. At 24, the kidney chi is balanced and even. The tendons and bones are strong. The teeth grow and reach their peak. At 32, the tendons and bones flourish. The flesh and muscles are full. At 40, the kidney's chi is in decline. The hair begins to recede and the teeth begin to wither. At 48, the yang chi is in decline and exhausted. The face withers and the hair turns white. At 56, the liver chi is in decline. The tian gui is exhausted and the essence is diminished. The kidney organ is in decline and the form of the body has reached its peak. At 64 years, the teeth and the hair fall out and lost. And that says the kidney is the ruler of the water. It receives the essence of the organs. Therefore, it is only when the five zong are flourishing that ejaculation can occur. In later life, the five zong are in decline, etc., and they can no longer conceive a child. This is like also when we're giving advice to men also about sexual activity. If their organs are exhausted, we counsel them not to have so many ejaculations because this tian gui comes from the organ strength. So then when it comes to the other aspect, how do you help people through this? And I'll shut up here in a second because I've been telling you for a long time, but what does it mean? For example, a woman going through menopause, how do we see it differently? Is it about hormones and disease? No, it's about the quality of water and rivers. So maybe I'll pause there and let you get in a word edgewise.
No, I mean, that's really interesting, and I had come across revisiting those, passages to again put together a story. I think, what you said is key about how, someone might be, um, going along fine, but then when you have an inflection point or you have some sort of change in a course change, that's a vulnerable time. And some of the reading I came across talks about menopause as an example of a critical window. And so, like, a critical window is a time when there's significant reorganization happening in the body or the brain. And so, uh, it means that it in itself isn't bad, but it's a time of increased vulnerability. So, like, the example I might give is, like, if a caterpillar goes into a chrysalis and then I think it, like, dissolves itself during that process, right? Then it's, like, highly vulnerable, but it's not to say that, going into a chrysalis is pathological or is an illness. It's none of those things. It's a time of transition and increased vulnerability, which means that for women, things that would not have been like stressors or issues that would not have necessarily been a problem for them in the past can become a problem. And also, particularly around mental health, because there's a reorganization that happens in the brain. One thing I found, because we talk a lot about the sides of the brain and brain lateralization, and one thing that came up with this is that, um, there's not such a thing as a male or a female brain, but there are tendencies, and women tend to have, uh, the right hemisphere of their brain more active and dominant compared to men. Women also tend to have more access to both sides than men, so it's a little bit less lateralized, and what brain scans are showing is that as women go into perimenopause and menopause, the dominance starts to shift from right to left, which is interesting because you do get a bit of a personality. You can get a bit of a personality change because, again, we're reorganizing for a different phase. On the other side of that, as you said, people might just, do fine, but also it can be a very rewarding time of life. It can be a very happy time of life. It can be a very, fulfilling time of life. So I think, because you talk so much, and so eloquently about the importance of story, and I think the key here is around story, which is to say that, yes, not all by any stretch of the imagination, but a significant portion of women will have disruptive symptoms around this time, and there also is a lot of research showing that there's an increased risk of certain diseases after this time. But we need to separate out: is it because menopause is a disease, or is it because it's a time of increased vulnerability, or it's a time that we're asking ourselves to shift the trajectory of our resources and how well we are doing that? Because if we get that story right, then what it means is that if you need assistance in shifting where you're putting your resources, then once you have that support, you can be healthy and thriving, versus, well, the risk of Alzheimer's skyrockets around this time, and insulin resistance, and therefore you need to go on a high protein diet and take hormones and all these things. But that advice is coming from a different story, which I think, whether you're looking at the Neijing or if you're looking at evolutionary biology, isn't necessarily the most helpful story or the most accurate story.
Right. And when we're working with women who are going through menopause or men, there's several different themes we're talking about. And one is this recognition that it's a life change. And so like imagine you're on a sailboat and you're going with the wind and then you're going to tack, right? You're going to change course. And there's that time when you're tacking coming about where the sail's luffing, it's blowing and everything's, the boat's not moving and the new course hasn't been set. That's kind of like what we're talking about. So the first recognition is this is a course correction. And in course corrections, we need to be aware of what's happening, be kind to ourselves, maybe take it a little bit easier, understanding that things are changing that way. That's just number one. Number two is there's this issue about, so, and this also goes with the symptoms we see. There's this issue of water. What's the quality of water? And a lot of the symptoms of menopause are dryness, lack of water symptoms. So we can work with that in different ways. The third thing is circulation. So in a woman, particularly in the first part of life, her strength is in her pelvis. That's where her power is. And for a man, it's in the upper body, and the pelvis is relatively deficient. The upper part of the body is strong. For women, it's the opposite, right? And that means, and the pelvis is where the energy returns to with the breath. And so women have an advantage there of a returning strength to root, right? But when those channels, when those rivers shut or slow down and the water slows down, then all of a sudden that power of return to the root is not so strong. And for women who are susceptible, they'll see it in reversal circulation problems, especially like at night with hot flashes where things are going backwards because they had a root and now the root is weakening, right? So that's the third thing. And we can help people there by restoring root energy and different things. And the fourth thing is about story, right? So in the beginning of a life, for women particularly, a lot of emphasis that nature puts into the female body is about pelvic related things, childbirth, menstruation, and worth and value and, oh, who am I, and all those things play into that story. And then all of a sudden it's released. And for some women that's difficult, like, what do I do now? What is my value now? Should I try to keep looking young, or what should I do? For other women it's a great release, like freedom. Oh my god, I don't have to do this all the time. I can go do what I want to do. And so that's a really important part of the dialogue of these changes for both men and women, but for particularly for women, I think. Those are the four things we help with. And I always say, like, nature, your body, breath, water, that's the basis. Then, like, say you work on that, someone still has a symptom, they need a hormone replacement or something like that. It's not the end of the world, but it's not the diet, it's the spice. That's a spice.
No, absolutely. I mean, I think, 'cause when I look at patients, I use a lot of, systems thinking of, like, input, process, output, which, is maybe, like, a lot less poetic than, nature-based, although you could apply this very nicely to nature. It's just a way of understanding a piece of it, and I tend to think of hormones as an output of that system. And so, what happens is when we can supplement with the output, we think we're solving the problem. But if it's a process that gave rise to the low output,
Right.
then you haven't necessarily helped that, and I think, again, this is where story comes in because I'm seeing women younger and younger on hormone replacement, so they're not taking it for menopause, they're taking it for other health issues, and not taking it for menopause is a little bit different because they're not menopausal yet, and this actually gets into an area that maybe there's also more, uh, overlap, which is that, um and this doesn't get talked about at all in the menopause literature, but it's, I think, extremely foundational and important, which is when we are inflamed or we experience a stressor or a trigger or a threat, and we go into the cell danger response, the body intentionally reduces its sensitivity to hormones as part of that healing cycle because hormones are meant to be made and circulate in the body to send messages far away so that if you have a something going on over on your elbow, the hormones are coming from the brain and the tissues and things like that. And when there's an emergency, you need to focus on the local issue. So when people are chronically inflamed, by definition, they have lower hormone sensitivity. We think of insulin sensitivity, but it could be estrogen or progesterone or any hormone. So that then, if we understand that, then the first step is often not going to be to supplement with hormones. Not to say that hormones are good or bad to supplement with, but it's just that if the body is trying to turn that down in order to heal, then it may be that that's not the place to start. And if you do, some people will feel better because it will have been low, not because they ran out. That's the other story. Your tank's empty. You need to put more gasoline in. It's like they didn't run out. The brain has decided to turn down that production. So they might feel better, or some people might not feel better. Because their body's trying to be resistant to it, they might not notice it. But then it just changes where you start. And I think we've talked about this before, where inflammation has overlap with this idea of counterflow in the Neijing.
Right. And there's a couple of important things here. When your body's in under stress, it means it stops connecting to rhythms and it's focused on an event, right? And hormones are essentially rhythm chemicals. They all mimic rhythms. And what's important to remember about hormones is that evolutionary terms, rhythms created hormones. Hormones don't create the rhythms, right? So the body develops because the sun rises, the sun sets, the phases of the moon, the seasons come and go. And there's this stable situation in the molecules in that system. Everything start to form around those rhythms. And the endocrine system is one of those things that formed around the rhythms, right? Um, so the rhythms create the hormones don't create the rhythms. So what that means is if you're looking at someone and you want to do hormone replacement, don't start by giving them tons of hormones. Start by looking at the rhythms and reestablish the rhythms in more organic ways first. And then if you still need a tweak, add a hormone. It's fine. It's going to work a lot better. Like you say, we're working at the core of the issue, not just like this kind of chemical pharmaceutical model that we have. Like you got a little thing, like let's dump a bunch of this other thing in you. How do you reestablish rhythms? Well, and as we've talked about before, and we need to have a podcast on time and rhythm because we're living in time and rhythm sickness days, they are totally a mess. And a lot of the problems people are having that we've lost rhythms. And so, like, how do you reestablish rhythms? Well, that's a whole different topic. But first, it's understanding that they're there, that they change during the day and the seasons in your life, and what are they, and how can you do things that reestablish rhythms? And that's all the base of this treatment, of this approach.
Absolutely, and in terms of, the things in our environment that we're sensitive to that help us set our rhythms, the strongest signal is from light.
It's the sun.
It's the sun, and darkness and it going away. I've recently moved house, and one of the things I love about it here is that it gets properly dark at night, and we can do some really great stargazing, and just the kind of relief of it, being dark, is really, really nice. And we haven't quite gotten too much into hormones yet. In the kind of industrial model and the Western model, it's all about hormones. Like menopause is about hormones, and all the physiology is about hormones. But and that model's limited. Like you say, the rhythms create the hormones. But the other piece of it is that there's actually another system that sits on top of the sex hormone system that tends to get discussed. So when people talk about menopause or menstruation, we're talking about estrogen and progesterone monthly rhythms, and maybe they'll mention testosterone somewhere. And they talk about the brain hormones that give rise to those things, like FSH and LH, follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. And it's all this discussion about hormones. Um, but on top of that endocrinology is a light directed endocrinology, and the master how would I put it? There's like a super hormone that's called POMC, pro-opiomelanocortin, and it's this giant thing that gets snipped up into all the major um, apex hormones in the body, and it gets snipped up according to light. So it when you snip it up, you create the signal for cortisol and DHEA. You create the signal for something called melanocyte stimulating hormone, which is related to it's related to being tan, but it's also related to your immune system. It's related to your energy system. It's related to how hungry you are. So it's all this like foraging stuff. It also will get snipped up and make beta endorphin because we were designed to be addicted to the sun. So you have pain relief in there. And so according to those light signals is how it's like an internal pharmacy. And I'm not here suggesting that we like throw out one reductionist endocrinology model and replace it with another, because what you're talking about is more accurate and more just fundamental to how the system actually works. But part of my kind of perspective, as someone who's studied a lot of biochemistry, is like if you're going to be reductionist, at least be more kind of inclusive and accurate about it, you know?
And here's the thing: women, due to their physiology, again, uterus-based humans, are more rhythm-based than men. Now, I want to say this also, like, because no matter how many times we have this conversation, we always think like yin is female and yang is male, and that's just not right. The female and male bodies, using our terminology, are almost all the same. I can't look at an X-ray and say that's a man and woman unless they have a breast shadow or something. I can't look at a blood test and say that's a man or a woman. They're pretty much the same. There's some differences, like you're talking about in brains and so forth. It's at the root where they're different. And there's something special about the pelvis, which said, like when it was developing, at a certain point it had to go left or right. It's not in your elbow where that happens, it's in your pelvis. There's something special about your root. And then you go, and then your life experience changes, right? When I see a male or a female patient, I don't really care that they're a male or a female. They're like men with prostates will have certain health concerns. Women who are menstruating, fine, that's a different issue. I don't really care about whether they're male or female. What I care about is how they move through these patterns of sacred motion. And so, for example, when we talk about yang, it's not male, it's the expanding, outgoing, setting down a pattern aspect of breath. Both men and women do that. When we talk about yin, we're talking about letting that pattern go and receiving and returning to the root to form another breath of life. Both men and women do that. So the question is not, it's more, do we understand the sacred nature of all those phases and embody them? Now, here's a really interesting thing. Women are more, the female body, the yin part is more earth based. The yang aspect is more heaven based. What does that mean? Heaven means more intangible patterns that come down and set things. So, like sperm, for example, doesn't have a lot of form, but it has patterning, right? And activation. Yin takes that and makes the form, right? So, heaven hands down the image, earth completes the form. That means also when we look at how women are treated in our culture or how our healthcare goes with women, it usually models how we think about ecology. So in countries where women are treated well, the ecology is usually treated well, right? Because it's more earth-based, the rhythms are stronger. They're more embodied. So women start out with an advantage in rhythm, right? It's in their body in a more core way. What's the story, though, we tell women? For example, well, I, and here I don't want to get into trouble about this because a lot of people have thought about it a lot more than me. But working with women patients, what I see a conundrum is like that the story they're told is, well, if you want to be successful, act like a man and also be a mother, and provide for the home and nurture the family. And so it's like an impossible thing, right? And what does that do? So it means a lot of women are just like fried, burned out, working all the time, trying to meet expectations that are unrealistic, which means they've lost their rhythm capacity. Like if you wake up in the morning and you're just going, 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 because you're trying to make a societal expectation that you're supposed to do all these things and be a CEO of a company, and breastfeed your child and do all these things, right? There's no rhythm there. And so the rhythm is already exhausted in many women and men, you know. And so, like, a question for us is, as this culture, or, just as a conversation, what does it mean that a female body could embody those rhythms and still express all the potential they have, in the ways they want? It just doesn't look like being a man, in ways that just doesn't say that. And for men, how can they embody rhythms more that have to do with letting go and receiving and recreating new life? So this is why I said at the beginning, this topic is like so fascinating, has so many threads.
No, absolutely. I mean, I grew up here in the United States, and I remember, different times where I've traveled to other countries, and that feeling of like things being closed on a Sunday. Where when I grew up, it's like you can get anything at any time, and on Sundays, it's just not the store's not open till 9, it's open till 7 type of thing, Whereas in these other places, it's like you're just not gonna get anything, but you're not gonna try, it's okay, um
And you get to take a nap.
and you
You
get to
have to.
take a nap, you have a little siesta, and so I think you're right in that we have a core sickness of our culture is lack of rhythms, and part of that is a 24/7 being always on, and it then does go, I guess there is an extra challenge, for women where if you're going to succeed according to certain standards, which include always being available or working very, unhealthy hours or, basically not caring about rhythm, and that's gonna be more, I suppose more of a departure perhaps than what, uh, many people would be optimized for, that's a big core, and I guess that it's like that sort of thing that wasn't sustainable anyways, and it may be that the perimenopause transition, it forces you to realize that.
And it means that when you get to that time, and remember, one of my students in a discussion last week, they were saying menopause tells you the scorecard of your early life. Like it becomes apparent, like how you lived. And so for many women, they're exhausted because of the time sicknesses we have, and then the unrealistic expectations. You're supposed to be a man and a woman, or a CEO and a all these things like that. And that exhausts the organs. And you remember in that passage, it's the organs, the stillness and their ability to hold essence that opens the rivers, that allows the rhythm. So by the time you get to be 50 and all those organs are exhausted, and then when you're trying to turn the sailboat, now you're sick. Yeah. So like there's so many threads here. The key one important thing though is because we're pharmaceutically based and thing based, we always focus on the hormones, you know, and the hormones are fine. They can be a game changer for people, but they're the spice. They're not the meal, rhythm, the way we live. We need to have another podcast on rhythm and timing, but like how, I don't know if it's the time to talk about that, but how do you help a patient reestablish rhythm? Maybe that's a whole different topic.
Yeah.
But it's this other thing, like for women also, how can you possibly succeed if you're swimming in an ocean of a story that is unrealistic? And that you hold it because you're swimming in that story and your family holds it unconsciously. So this is where we come back to the importance of stories. Can we collectively retell a story about what it means to be a woman and a man, or gender fluid, and what are the sacred aspects of the outgoing breath and the ingoing breath, and how they're equally sacred and powerful? And do we know how to use them to support life?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's why, I mean, I say this, like, tongue in cheek, but a big part of my approach to helping people involves a lot of brainwashing or unbrainwashing or rebrainwashing, because,
Right.
uh, people are not the story is the water that you're swimming in, so you may not know that you have it. You may not know where it came from, and so it's like if someone's within that story of needing to be working hours that they couldn't possibly do in a healthy way or have a blue screen on their eyes at 11 p.m. and do all of these crazy things, and then they come and they say, "You know what? I've got like some hot flashes. Can I have some hormones?" It's like it's just kind of missing the forest for the trees, and so there has to be a a way of helping someone become aware of it and then to come out of it. It's which is to say, and not to say that even that fixes everything all the time, but at least you're asking the right questions, you're trying to solve the right problems, and sometimes just waking up to the impossibility of or like the the mismatch of that story sometimes is the medicine in itself.
It's the total medicine. And how can you solve any of these problems when you live in these collective stories? And we're, as I say, we're just born species. We think we're advanced, but we're just like we were just born, and we're just trying to grope around and figure things out. We don't know the operating system of the human being, and we're just making errors and trial and error and so forth. But one of the things is we don't understand this core principle of the Neijing, which that every aspect of breath is sacred, equally sacred, life-giving power. It has different qualities. So we're young, and we live in a culture where things are moving outwards, and we call that a yang motion. So we value yang motion, and we call that male. And so we value male. But what happens if you're born female? Now you're living in a world that discredits you in so many ways because that's not what we're doing here. Now the world is breaking down because nature is invoking a reverting breath. That's the domain of yin, right? So now the male representations all of a sudden look fragile and toxic and confused, and they don't know what they're doing and so forth. And women look stronger and so forth. Both of those representations are minimal outlooks on the power of breath and life. So when we want to be an immersive, healthy, full embodied person, it means that we can move with outward going breath and we feel the divine nature of it, and we can just easily turn and go to reverting breath and receiving breath and feel the divine power and strength in that for both men and women. But this is like several chapters down the road from where we are now in our evolution.
Yeah, it's but it's nice having language around it and kind of
We've got it outlined.
yeah, we got
Where
an
to go.
outline and kinda teasing out kind of these half truths, like, yang is male and yin is female is like a half truth. It's not that it didn't come from nowhere, but it's just not, like, accurate or helpful.
If you go back to the root in your pelvis, and that they try to make that just, like if you believe men and women are reincarnated, it's like, well, I've been a woman many times than a man, and it's just like the luck of the draw. You go in that door, you go in that door. And then like some people are kind of in the middle a little bit, and then there's fluidity. It's like I got the wrong body here, what's going on? But we're basically the same. But if you look at like the male sexual organs, they are outgoing, initiating organs, and that's a yang motion. So we say yang is male. And if you look at the female organs, they are receiving, incorporating. And by the way, it doesn't mean passive to receive, it means take something in and create new life and give it back. And that's in your organs. So we say, well, yin is female, and we value yang, so yin is not so valued. So all you women, you're going to swim in an ocean where you're just not valued as much, you know? And that takes the breath out of everything, you know? And what about the men, for example, who actually also have a yin component but can't realize it because all their role models are like, well, you need to look like this. It's interesting also, like I work with lots of women over my life and men too, and and there's patterns they have. And one thing that always makes me sad is when I see women who are disempowered. which is very common, by the way, because if you have a yin flavor, one aspect of yin is to respond to something and accommodate it. Do you know? That's actually part of yin breath, receiving. But it also means, well, you can be led and talked into something easier, you know? So then you become disempowered for whatever reasons. And sometimes I just want to like say, excuse me, you're a woman. You can make life in your pelvis. That is so powerful. Do you know? But somehow there's a disconnect for both men and women. They have versions of that and they lose that thread and they get talked out of things. And it always is a poignant moment for me when I see that in my clinic. It's like, oh my God, you can make a human. You know, that is like the ultimate power, you know? So these stories disconnect us from all these truths. Yeah. And people that run things really like it when they can disconnect you from your truths, because then it's easy to like have you do things that they want, you know? Not to be a conspiracy theorist here, but
Oh, no, we love conspiracy theories here.
what I mean, yeah, it's just it's people, and it's a big mess. But like, how do you reestablish the order of this? You know, for us, when we say we're nature-based medicine people, it means when it's a mess, don't try and fix the mess, erase it, and go back to the blackboard, and that's nature. So how does nature, like a tree, for example, it has exact same pattern of this. It has its own water. When it's young, it's full of that water. It has a root, just like a pelvis. It has a midlife, a young life, a later life. In midlife, it changes course. An aspect of that is the water dries up. Do you know? So this is like happening in nature. So yeah. The other thing is this. When I say like all aspects of the breath of life are sacred, it means the withered, graying, aging aspect is equally as sacred as the just born, full of fluid aspect, just as powerful. The dying is just as sacred and just as powerful as the birthing. You know, so another part of menopause is like, how can I not age? And another thread of this conversation is aging is breath, and it's sacred and it's wisdom and it's accumulation of experience, you know. And so let's not try and give you testosterone and hormones to make you look like you're 18. Do you know? If you're having symptoms, yes, but breathe with the sacred aspect of seasons and learn what the sacred nature of that is. And you get a whole new chance as a woman or a man. Aging is wonderful, you know, except for like the groaning to get out of bed and tie your shoes in the morning. There's so much freedom in it. When you're young, you have to decide what your life is. It's so exhausting. Do you know? When you're old, you kind of got that figured out a little bit. And it's so freeing. There's so much beauty in aging. But that's part of the thread of this story, too.
So it's simple. It's like a menopause, simple.
You know, it comes always back to nature and stories and heart centered living. That's really kind of like what we return to all the time. Um, yeah, and it's the story is the key to this. Can is as we've been talking about today. How can you navigate this well if you swim in a cultural story that talks about your worth and gives you unrealistic expectations and takes away your rhythm? It's impossible, you know. But stories, especially when they're told collectively, are like our superpower because as soon as we tell them a better story, when we tell a better story, nature can breathe through it. And nature is the power that really runs everything, right? So if you give nature a good story, it's like the water can flow into it, the air can flow into it, and it displaces stories that are not so filled with nature's breath and water and the fluid of the rivers and so forth.
So so it's really interesting. We've learned that men also go through menopause in the Neijing. We've learned that all aspects of the breath are sacred, which is a recurring theme that I don't think can be said enough. Really, it's kind of a resistance dissolver.
It's a long learning thing too. Like you have to hear it over and over. My death is as sacred as my birth. What? The 10,000th time you hear that, you go, "Oh, I kind of get it."
Is there anything else that we should, speak to or include on the
I would love to retell the story about sex
okay.
also, because I'm not going to do it today. But how many levels of story do we tell about sex that did not serve us? You know, and think about this: you're going to have sex with someone, man, woman, 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 man, man, whatever, and think of it as a mixing of your primordial waters. I also think, like, let's be
Or not
honest.
though, if you're trying not to do that.
Right, or not. Um, I also think it's kind of weird that the genitals kind of look weird if we're honest. I mean, there's a beauty there, like a vagina can look like a flower, or whatever, but it doesn't look like an elbow, right? A penis is kind of strange. Testicles kind of weird. So here's my other story about them. They're kind of unusual sea creatures that you might see like at the
Okay.
bottom of the ocean, right? Like a sea cucumber and a kind of an anemone or something. So, like when you're having, this is the poetic retelling of a story. So when you're having sex, it's your mysterious sea creatures coming together and merging your primordial waters. And out of those waters, if you're trying, a new life can come.
So these are this is, good fodder for, like, new pickup lines because I don't think I've heard that before.
Yeah, this is the power story. Like it can be a lot better. Yeah.
Very cool. Well,
So
we can tackle that
another day.
another day.
Yeah, then we'll really get into trouble. Oh my God.
Good, good.
All right. Well, I'll look forward to seeing you next time. And so many threads in this. Oh my gosh.
So many
What did
threads, so
what
many
did
stories to rewrite.
what did you get out of this from like you've been doing all this research? What did it change any of what you
Oh,
learned?
I you know, it's funny with stories, I've been aware of the power of story for a long time, and that means that I often, when I'm speaking with most people, I have a certain protectiveness because there's a good chance that if I'm either listening to some sort of media or I'm speaking with a random person, that what's gonna come out is bullshit. Like that's like kind of my default assumption. And so when I'm around, someone or a story that I know is not, it's not trying to prove itself, like it's not trying to, I don't know, get attention. It's founded and it's rooted and it's accurate and it's rational and it's deep, then I can just relax into it. So even as I was researching this topic before speaking with you, there's still a tension because I have to kind of go, am I going to, with any idea or anything I read, I'm like, am I going to let you in? Like, how am I, what am I going to evaluate you against? And so when I hear these conversations and about how nature works and how what happens in nature, then it's just for me, it's just very nice because it feels safer and more beautiful and life giving, and then I can relax into it a bit. I don't need to like be like debating it or arguing with it.
Yeah. When you're on nature's team, you're always on the winning
There
team.
you go.
Yeah. That's a t-shirt.
There you go. That's a t-shirt and a pickup line. No.
All right. Well, this is a great conversation. I look forward to hearing more about your work and we can talk more about these threads in the future. How about that?
Sounds good. I love it.
All right. I'll see you next
All
time.
right. Take care.